All right, narrative analysts, buckle up. What you're about to hear might just flip everything you thought you knew about the WNBA on its head. For weeks now, the league has been busy building what looks like a wall of denial around Caitlin Clark's treatment on the court. Broadcasters call it rookie hazing, coaches label it competitive fire, and officials, well, they act like nothing unusual is happening at all. But if you start following the statistical breadcrumbs, and I mean the real numbers the league doesn't want you looking at, you'll find a pattern so consistent, so blatant, that it stops being a coincidence and starts looking like a blueprint. This isn't just about one flagrant foul or one reckless elbow. This goes way deeper than the Marina Mabrey incident. What we're uncovering points to something systematic, a coordinated effort to physically dim Caitlin Clark's spotlight every time it shines too bright. And here's the kicker. The evidence doesn't come from rumors or locker room whispers. It comes from raw numbers, documented fouls, and public records that anyone can trace. The smoking gun is right there in plain sight. So if you've been told this is just part of the game or that Clark is being treated like every other rookie before her, stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see why that narrative collapses under the weight of its own data. And if you're ready to dig deeper than the mainstream headlines and connect dots the league would rather you ignore, make sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to lay out goes way beyond surface-level commentary. This is the kind of analysis that could force answers from people in very high places.
The moment came in the third quarter after Fever guard Caitlin Clark was poked in the eye by Sun guard J.C. Sheldon while Sheldon was playing defense. This led to a brief scuffle between Clark and Sheldon. Actually, it led to J.C. just kept running up on. I watched the video again. I was like, why is she doing that? Clark is obviously trying to get some space away from her, and she made it worse, which prompted Connecticut veteran Marina Mabrey to come up and shove Clark to the ground. Is that what we're calling it? Because it wasn't a shove. It was, I'm going to drive my entire body into your body.
Now, let's move from claims to cold, undeniable numbers. Because if there's one thing that doesn't lie, it's the stats. Here's the reality. The average WNBA player experiences a flagrant foul once every 47 games. That's basically once a season, maybe less. For the league's biggest stars, A'ja Wilson, Breanna Stewart, the rate climbs a bit higher. Rougher defense, more minutes, higher stakes. On average, about once every 35 games. But Caitlin Clark? She's on a completely different planet. At the current pace, Clark is drawing a flagrant foul once every 18 games, almost double the rate of the league's brightest stars and more than 2.5 times the average player. Think about that for a second. Rookie or not, Clark is being targeted with dangerous contact at a rate that doesn't just raise eyebrows, it raises questions. This isn't rookie bumps or initiation. This is the kind of statistical red flag that in other industries would trigger federal investigators, not sports commentators. And here's where it gets even more eye-opening. These aren't just sloppy fouls from players out of position. We're talking about high-risk plays, the kind that risk injury, the kind that shorten careers. That frequency alone doesn't just suggest tougher competition, it suggests intent. Now, some analysts will argue this is simply because Clark has the ball in her hands more, or because she's always in the spotlight. But here's the problem with that defense. Other stars in the exact same position, the ones carrying their teams, logging huge minutes, commanding defenses every possession, still don't come close to Clark's rate of being hit with flagrants.
So when the numbers show Clark absorbing nearly twice the flagrant contact with half the league protection, we're no longer talking about coincidence. We're staring at a pattern. And as you're about to see, once you map these fouls out across the season, another disturbing truth jumps out. They aren't random at all.
And then Marina Mabrey comes out of nowhere and chucks her to the floor. Now let's watch this in slow motion. Here, J.C. Sheldon is guarding Caitlin, swipes her in the face. There's one. Going for the ball, swipes her in the eyeball. Caitlin's gonna have to start wearing goggles. And then Caitlin pushes her off of her, like, why are you still in my face? Marina Mabrey, bat out of hell, chucks Caitlin Clark to the ground. Now after this, you guys, of course, the referees are going to review the play because that's a lot of contact going on right there. That's a lot of unnecessary contact. That's a lot of non-basketball contact happening during this play, right? So the 3 referees that I like to say, they got them straight out of Sephora because I don't think these referees have ever refereed a professional basketball game in their life. They took these referees, they were at the monitor, they looked at it for, I'm not even exaggerating, you guys, like 15 minutes. 15 minutes they are watching this play over and over.
Now, statistics are one thing, but the type of fouls Clark has been taking tells an even darker story. We're not talking about routine reach-ins or clumsy box-outs. The pattern here is far more alarming. Eye pokes, blind side hits, body slams, and deliberate shoulder checks delivered when she's least able to protect herself. These aren't just hard fouls. These are the kinds of plays that can derail a career in a split second. And here's the part that should make everyone pause. These hits aren't scattered randomly across the schedule. They cluster. Again and again, the ugliest fouls show up in nationally televised games, playoff-style atmospheres, or the exact moments when Clark has the ball and the spotlight. The most reckless fouls suddenly appear. That's not coincidence. That looks a lot like intent. Almost as if someone wants to send a message, dim the light, slow her momentum, and remind her that too much attention comes with a price. Even more disturbing is the style of contact. Players aren't just making mistakes while defending her, they're targeting vulnerable moments. Eyes, ribs, blind angles, moves designed not just to disrupt a shot, but to rattle her confidence, knock her off rhythm, and plant the idea that every possession could be dangerous. And yet, while fans at home can see the replays, while social media explodes with outrage, the official response is almost always muted. A delayed whistle, a downgraded foul, or in some cases, no call at all. So we have the numbers showing an impossible frequency, and the nature of those fouls showing an undeniable pattern. But if you think this ends with isolated, reckless plays, you're wrong. Because when we look closer at the players delivering those hits and the way their own families talk about it, the story takes an even sharper turn.
The announcers here are saying, of course, Marina Mabrey is going to get ejected because that was unwarranted. She literally came out of nowhere and chucked Caitlin Clark. There should be a flagrant one, of course, on JC Sheldon because she swiped her and hit her in the eyeball. Whether it is intentional or not, you can still have a flagrant a flagrant foul called on you, whether you are trying to intentionally hurt somebody or not. But this is what they called, you guys. This is what they called. Caitlin Clark, Marina Mabrey, Tina Charles were assessed with technical fouls on Tuesday. Caitlin, Marina, and Tina Charles. Technical fouls. That's it. Technical fouls. That's it. And JC Sheldon was assessed with a flagrant 1 foul, and no players were ejected.
If there's one incident that pulled the curtain back on this whole story, it was the clash with Marina Mabrey. On the surface, commentators brushed it off as just another hard foul. But when you look closer, especially at how Mabrey's own family described it, the picture gets a lot harder to ignore. Shortly after the play went viral, Marina's sister Dre Mabrey posted a TikTok that sent shockwaves through fans. The video was simple, just a reaction clip, but the caption said everything. Another day of us watching Marina do crazy shit. Now pause on that for a moment. That's not an isolated defense of a single play. That's an admission, straight from her own family, that this kind of behavior isn't new. It's a pattern that they've not only recognized, but basically normalized. And here's where it matters. Publicly, the narrative spun by teammates, coaches, and analysts painted Mabrey as just a fiery competitor, someone who plays with passion, someone you'd want on your side. But her sister's words cut right through that defense. Because if crazy shit is just another day, then we're not talking about a one-off moment of passion. We're talking about a repeated style of play that finally boiled over in front of millions of viewers. From a legal standpoint, that TikTok undermines the very narrative the league tried to lean on. If a player has an established pattern of reckless aggression and the league fails to discipline it properly, it shifts from being a competitive moment into something more dangerous, a workplace environment where officials knowingly allow repeat offenders to put others at risk. And remember, this wasn't just a casual foul. We're talking about an escalation that played out after a season-long pattern of officials ignoring smaller hits, delayed whistles, and downgraded calls against Clark. By the time Marina's collision happened, it wasn't a shock. It was inevitable. So, when you line up the family's candid admission with the league's weak disciplinary response, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just unlucky. She was the victim of a system that allowed repeat aggression to go unchecked until it boiled over in the national spotlight. But what makes this even more alarming is how the league itself handled the incident and how their timeline of inaction set the stage for everything that followed. To really understand why the Marina Mabrey collision wasn't just another foul, you have to look at the sequence of failures that led straight to it. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. It was the predictable result of a system that had already broken down. Let's trace the timeline. Earlier in the season, Clark takes an eye poke, obvious contact, dangerous, the kind of play that can cause permanent damage. The whistle, delayed. Officials looked hesitant, almost as if they were waiting to see how Clark reacted before deciding to even call it. Fast forward a few games, another reckless play, this time a blindside body check. The result? A minimal technical foul, downgraded on review. Again, the message sent loud and clear. Clark wasn't going to get the same level of protection that other stars routinely receive. And with every one of those non-responses, the league created the perfect storm. Because when officials fail to enforce boundaries, players start testing them. If small infractions get ignored, bigger ones follow. And eventually, you get what happened on June 17th. An incident so blatant, it stopped the sports world in its tracks. Think about the review process for that foul. It took officials more than 15 minutes to sort through what was obvious to everyone watching live: flagrant contact, intentional escalation. Yet after all that time, the outcome was still weak. Just a technical foul, no ejection, no suspension. That wasn't discipline, that was delay. And the delay itself sent a message. Caitlin Clark could be hit harder, fouled dirtier, and the consequences would always lag behind. This is why the Marina Mabrey incident matters so much. It wasn't just one player losing control. It was the inevitable endpoint of a system that had already failed. A pattern of soft whistles, delayed reviews, and downgraded penalties that told opponents, go ahead, test the limits, because enforcement isn't coming until it's too late. And here's the kicker. When you start looking at the numbers, those failures don't appear random either. They seem to follow a very specific pattern tied to who's holding the whistle in the first place. Now, if you think the story ends once the foul is called, think again, because the real disparity shows up in the aftermath. Here's the normal playbook. When a star player in the WNBA takes a dangerous hit, A'ja Wilson, Breanna Stewart, Elena Delle Donne, the league moves fast. Ejections happen on the spot. Technicals get upgraded to flagrant almost immediately. Suspensions and fines follow within hours. The system usually overcorrects to protect the league's most valuable names. But Caitlin Clark? She's living in a completely different reality. Instead of immediate whistles and instant ejections, her fouls get met with hesitation. Instead of suspensions, we get quiet technical upgrades buried in post-game reports. And instead of swift fines, we get silence. Until the public outcry grows too loud for the league to ignore. Only then does anything happen, and even then, the punishment is almost laughably small. Take the Mabrey incident. A hit that any other star would have seen trigger an automatic suspension somehow ended with no suspension at all, no additional fine, no extra discipline. Business as usual, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. This isn't just an oversight, it's a pattern. For other stars, the system acts like a shield. For Clark, it acts like a delay.
And those delays don't just protect reckless players, they send a message to the entire league that Clark is fair game. And if you think that sounds harsh, consider this. We have years of precedent showing how the league normally responds to this level of contact. Yet when it comes to Clark, the script changes. Same fouls, completely different aftermath. So the question isn't just why these fouls keep happening, the question is why the league seems so reluctant to enforce the very rules it uses to protect every other star. And when you follow the money, when you look at the commercial value Clark brings in compared to anyone else in the league, the double standard becomes even harder to explain. Here's where the entire conversation shifts. Because this isn't just about fouls, whistles, or officiating mistakes anymore. It's about money, it's about liability, and it's about the league's most valuable commercial asset being left unprotected. Let's start with the numbers the league can't deny. Since Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, merchandise sales have spiked by more than 600%. Viewership is up over 170%. App engagement has jumped an incredible 613%. In other words, Clark isn't just a rookie, she's an economic engine that's already transformed the league's bottom line. Now stack that against the on-court reality. Clark is drawing twice the flagrant contact of other stars, but receiving only half the protection. The league's biggest moneymaker, the very player responsible for historic growth, is also the one most at risk, not from competition, but from neglect. And this is where the conversation moves out of the sports arena and into the legal one. Because when a workplace allows its most valuable employee to be systematically targeted, when rules aren't enforced consistently, and when protection is applied unequally, that's not just bad business. That starts to look like discrimination.
Think about the parallel here. In the corporate world, if a company ignored repeated harassment of its most visible employee despite clear evidence and documented patterns, they wouldn't just face PR backlash. They'd face lawsuits, federal inquiries, and civil rights investigations. So when critics say this is just basketball, just tough defense, just part of the game, the numbers tell a different story. This isn't random contact. It's a documented pattern of disparate treatment, the exact kind of evidence lawyers and investigators look for when building a case. And if that sounds dramatic, consider this. Even US senators are starting to ask the same questions, which means what began as a sports controversy is now creeping into the halls of power. When a sports story gets big enough, it eventually breaks through the bubble of the game itself. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because the questions surrounding Caitlin Clark's treatment have already reached Washington, D.C. It started with Senator Jim Banks, who issued a formal letter demanding answers. He didn't just speak in generalities either. He cited the very same statistical patterns we've been laying out. Clark taking dangerous contact at nearly twice the rate of her peers, while seeing half the league enforcement. His words weren't framed as sports commentary, they were framed as institutional concern. And that's what makes this moment so significant. Because when lawmakers begin putting those numbers into official letters, it stops being about whether fans feel like Clark is being targeted. It becomes a matter of record. Now, some critics will dismiss this as partisan politics, as if it's just a senator looking for headlines. But here's the key. Once the data gets into government files, it no longer belongs to partisan spin. It becomes evidence that institutions are forced to acknowledge, no matter which side of the aisle they sit on. And the ripple effect is already happening. By citing statistical disparities in public documents, the debate over Clark's treatment shifts from being a sports controversy to being a potential workplace issue, one serious enough for political figures to press the league for answers. Think about how rare that is. Sports controversies almost never make it into Senate letters unless the concern is real. And once politics gets involved, the pressure doesn't stay confined to public statements. It builds into something far more serious: formal investigations, legal inquiries, and institutional accountability. So while the NBWA may be hoping this all blows over, the reality is the opposite. The more data piles up, the more voices outside of basketball begin weighing in.
And as history has shown in every industry, once political institutions start asking questions, the legal system isn't far behind. This is where the story shifts from controversy to potential liability. Because once you strip away the basketball jargon and look at the numbers in legal terms, what emerges looks strikingly similar to a hostile workplace case. Here's how the law usually works. In federal investigations, the question isn't whether a company or organization intended to discriminate. The question is whether there's documented evidence of disparate treatment. In other words, did one employee face harsher conditions, more risk, or less protection than their peers in the same workplace?
Now, line that up with Clark's reality. She's taking flagrant fouls at nearly double the rate of her peers. She's receiving half the disciplinary protection, and the league's own officials have been documented downgrading obvious fouls or delaying whistles in ways that extend that vulnerability. That's a textbook pattern of unequal treatment, the very kind of statistical evidence federal investigators use to prove a case. Think of it this way. In the corporate world, if a company ignored repeated harassment of its most visible employee, despite video evidence, family admissions, and mounting complaints, it wouldn't matter whether management claimed it was just tough culture. The law would treat it as a failure to protect, a breach of duty that exposes the entire institution to liability. Legal analysts are already noticing this. In fact, the Wall Street Journal recently published an op-ed by Sean Milan outlining how Clark's treatment mirrors the standards courts apply in hostile work environment claims. His point was simple but devastating. You don't need to prove intent. You only need to prove the pattern. And the WNBA's own record is building that case for anyone willing to look. And remember, Clark isn't just any employee. She's the league's most valuable commercial asset, directly responsible for historic revenue spikes, which means every ignored foul, every delayed whistle, every inadequate penalty isn't just a safety issue, it's a financial one. It creates grounds for arguing that the league failed to protect the very player it profits from the most. This is why lawyers, commentators, and now even senators are circling around the same conclusion. What's happening here is bigger than sports. It's the type of systemic neglect that has triggered federal civil rights investigations in other industries. And if you think that sounds extreme, wait until you see how Marina Mabrey herself responded once the legal and political spotlights turned her way. Now, here's where things take a fascinating turn. Because up until this point, Marina Mabrey had stayed mostly quiet. No fiery press conferences, no public defenses, just silence while the clips circulated online. But then something changed. As soon as mainstream outlets began picking up the statistical patterns, and as soon as political figures started citing the numbers in official letters, Mabrey suddenly launched into a full-scale media blitz. Her message? That the outrage was an overreaction. She leaned on the idea that her foul against Clark was just part of the game, the kind of physical play that happens every night in the WNBA. Nothing personal, nothing systemic, just basketball. But here's the problem with that defense. Legally, it doesn't help her case. In fact, it does the opposite. By labeling the backlash an overreaction, Mabrey essentially admitted that her response on the court was disproportionate to the situation, which is exactly what critics had been saying all along. If anything, her words confirmed the core argument. Clark wasn't being treated like other players. And then there's the timing. Why go public only after senators, journalists, and analysts began lining up the same data? Why stay quiet until the narrative shifted from sports talk to potential legal liability? For many observers, the answer was obvious. This wasn't a spontaneous defense. This was damage control. The league and Mabrey both needed the story reframed. They needed to steer the conversation away from words like targeting and systemic and back into the safer territory of competitive fire. But the problem is, once the numbers are out there, spin can only do so much. Because in the end, Mabrey's response didn't erase the footage, didn't erase her sister's TikTok, and didn't erase the statistical record showing Clark is absorbing dangerous contact at historic levels. If anything, her attempt to downplay the moment only reinforced how serious the implications have become.
And that brings us to the bigger picture. Because no matter how much the league or its players try to reframe the narrative, the raw data doesn't lie. And those numbers are exactly what federal investigators look for when deciding whether or not to step in. When you step back from the headlines, the replays, and the interviews, the bigger picture becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't about one foul. It isn't about Marina Mabrey. It isn't even about officiating mistakes. It's about a system that piece by piece has created an environment where Caitlin Clark takes the hardest hits, gets the weakest protection, and faces the slowest responses. And the evidence isn't buried in rumor or speculation. It's in plain sight. Every foul is documented. Every delayed whistle is on tape. Every downgraded call is recorded in the official box score, which means the league itself is keeping a paper trail of the very pattern critics say proves systematic targeting. That's why this conversation isn't going away. Numbers don't depend on emotion. Numbers don't care about excuses. And right now, the numbers show Clark taking nearly twice the dangerous contact with half the league protection. That's the kind of disparity that in any other workplace would trigger investigations, lawsuits, and resignations. And here's the most important point. Intent doesn't matter. Legally, whether players meant to target Clark is irrelevant. What matters is the outcome, a documented pattern of harsher treatment with inadequate institutional response. That's the very definition of disparate treatment, and it's exactly the standard federal investigators use when deciding whether or not to step in. So when fans argue this is all just tough rookie defense, they're missing the forest for the trees. Because this isn't just Clark's problem. This is the league's problem. Every official who swallowed the whistle, every disciplinary body that handed out watered-down punishments, every executive who let this slide, they're all part of a system now staring at potential liability. And that liability doesn't just endanger Clark. It endangers the credibility of the entire WNBA. Because if the league's biggest star, the player driving record-breaking ratings and sales, isn't protected, what does that say to everyone else? Which is why this isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. So now you've seen the numbers, the fouls, the aftermaths, and the patterns the league can't explain away. And here's the truth. This isn't a finished story. It's just the first chapter.
That's why I want to hear from you, the analysts, the fans, the ones paying closer attention than the mainstream headlines ever will. Do you see the same patterns in these games? Have you noticed the delayed whistles, the downgraded calls, the hits that go ignored? Drop your breakdowns in the comments, because every perspective helps build the record that the league is trying not to acknowledge. And if you want to keep following the trail of evidence, the data, the timelines, the statistical breadcrumbs, make sure you're subscribed, because what we're uncovering here isn't speculation, it's documentation. And the deeper we dig, the more undeniable it becomes. Don't just keep this to yourself. Share it with anyone who still thinks the targeting claims are exaggerated. Show them the numbers. Show them the clips. Show them the federal standards that prove this goes beyond basketball. Because while the league might hope this fades away, the reality is the scrutiny is only growing. Political voices are weighing in. Legal analysts are outlining frameworks, and federal investigators are watching the same numbers we just walked through. The real question isn't if this becomes a formal investigation. The real question is when. And in the coming weeks, we'll be tracking every foul, every suspicious whistle, every disciplinary decision, connecting the dots that the mainstream coverage refuses to. So stay tuned, because this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a story that could redefine not just Caitlin Clark's career, but the accountability of the WNBA itself.